Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have significant developments in the east where the Russians have captured over 50 square kilometers of territory in a single day. We start out in the New York section of the front line where the Russians have managed to capture the rest of the city, including the industrial area. The entirety of New York has now fallen into Russian hands and they have entered into Nelipivka. But the objective of the Russians here is to push in a northern direction to flank Toretsk from the south, expanding the front line significantly and putting pressure on the flank of the Ukrainian defenses in the north. At the same time, the Russians have managed to capture the Teriko hill here in the southwest of Toretsk. They've also managed to capture the rest of the electrical substation and have captured the fortified positions of the 2014 line of defense to enter Nelipivka from the east as well. At the same time, positional fighting has started in the direction of the fortified positions here to the west of New York. This indicates a general offensive by the Russians following the capture of New York in a northern direction to try and catch the Ukrainian defenses off balance. Now that they've withdrawn to these villages to the north, they want to fight them while they're still on the move and take advantage of the momentum to keep pushing on the flank of Toretsk. The capture of New York came in just less than 2 months. The Russians started the operations last month and they finished them this month. This led to one of the strongest fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the 2014 line of defense to fall very quickly. This has also led to the Russians' position in Toretsk improving for it to then enter the new stage where the fighting has already reached the residential area of the city, and now with the second Terikon under Russian control, they are now under control of the second line of defense entirely. This leads the Russians to have no fortified positions between them and the residential areas of Toretsk. We'll now see the second stage of the Battle of Toretsk starting, and that is the Russians storming the residential area, and it could be reminiscent of the Battle of Bakhmut. At the same time, to the southwest in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in 3 separate directions, capturing 4 different villages. In the south of Novoselivka Percha, the Ukrainians pulled out from the entirety of the east of the Vovcha river line, leading to the Russian capture of Skushne and Meshove here on the eastern bank, as well as the capture of the fortified positions to the north of it. This allows the Russians to concentrate a large amount of forces here in the north, as they do not have to have as many troops in the eastern parts due to the river line acting as a defensive flank for them. And this will allow the Russians to continue their offensive operations here to the north, where they'll push in the direction of Karelivka from the flank. There is now only 2 villages between the Russian positions in Shavine to Karelivka, and these are all located on the high ground. We can see from the topographic map the Russian positions by Mykolaiivka here in the north. Moving down south to the flank of Karelivka in the south will allow the Russians to take control of the high ground located at an elevation of 220 meters compared to the village at a location of 146 meters. This is almost an 80-meter height advantage, and we see that the Russians will likely push along from Mykolaiivka and down south along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, while at the same time pushing along the river line, where they managed to capture the northernmost villages, leaving only these 3 villages in the eastern parts along the river line. Therefore, it is very likely that the Russians will launch 2 prone attack, one directly along the river line here in the western bank of it, and one down south from Mykolaiivka along the fortified positions to gain full control of the heights in the area, as well as to push towards the flank of Karelivka. So we see that the Russians here are going to be threatening the Ukrainian line of defense west of Krasnoorivka, the village chain from Kurakhove to Karelivka, by flanking it from the western parts in the heights over the fortified positions, which could lead to the Russians simply moving in a southern direction, avoiding this defensive line entirely, to then flank it, cut off all of its supplies, and simply cut off the Ukrainian positions there. The longer south the Russians advance south of Mykolaiivka, the more the Ukrainians would have to either fall back or launch a counterattack to disrupt the Russian advances. The Russians will likely start fighting over Novhorodivka and Selidove now that their flanks have been secured. And with the capture of the village of Savitne here to the south of Noye Zelane, where they can now push towards Putishe and Kalinove, as well as with the control over Kruchi Yar, which has been gained here to the north of Novhorodivka, the Russians can attack Novhorodivka from a wide front from the east to the north and potentially flanking from the south through Melenivka to attack Novhorodivka from its entire line of defense, or potentially even flanking it from the rear by pushing through the northern and southern flanks, cutting off the supplies going into the town. So we see that the Russians are developing the offensive operation towards Novhorodivka with the positional fighting on the flanks of it. The Russians, with the push towards Kruchi Yar, have also reached the third line of defense and the final line of defense between the Russian positions and Pokrovsk. These two advances by themselves are very significant, as the Russians now have full control over New York. They are going to be developing the offensive operations in the direction of Toretsk. They have full control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha River, and they have developed the offensive operations towards Karlivka, Selidove, and Novhorodivka, as well as Rodivka, towards Pokrovsk. So heavy fighting is taking place in the Pokrovsk and New York section of the front line, / Toretsk section of the front line. In the south by Vodiane, the Russians have expanded slightly more here in the direction of the village as they continue developing offensive operations along this road here. The current objective of the Russians is to gain control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. They've cut off the road in the north, which isolates the fortified position from that direction, and with the push to the south, they're isolating it from Volodar. Now the push is from the south and from the north, and they'll be able to pincer the fortified positions. To gain control of it will lead to control over this section of the road. This would allow the Russians to then develop offensive operations in the direction of Vodiane, and with several roads connected to this road from the east, it will allow the Russians to supply a offensive operation towards the flank of Volodar, or even directly from the road and down south, or towards Konstantinivka in the north. We see that the situation in the Donetsk region is becoming critical for the Ukrainians, with heavy pressure on significant towns and cities in the region. Moving on to the Bakhmut front, the Russians have expanded slightly south of Ivanivsk as they start developing operations here in the section of the front line to gain control over the eastern bank of the canal. This is to develop offensive operations in the northern flank of Toretsk, where the fighting has largely been very slow compared to the New York direction, and generally just the eastern parts of Toretsk there's been significant advances by the Russians over these past 2 months, yet in the northern flank there's hardly been much development. If the Russians gain control over the canal line, they will be able to develop offensive operations towards the northern flank of Toretsk, similarly to the pushes to the south from the New York direction, which could lead to an encirclement or operational encirclement of Toretsk itself by flanking it from the northern positions. Further north here in the direction of Makiivka, the Russians have expanded further, where they're attacking in 3 separate directions. They have crossed the Sirbits river line in the north, where they're looking to gain control over the western bank of Makiivka as well. They're pushing from the northern parts in the southern direction and the southern parts in the western direction to gain full control over the eastern parts of Makiivka. We're likely going to see further offensive operations of the Russians gain full control over Makiivka, both in the western parts and in the southern parts, which will lead to a significant development here as well, as the Russians have so far largely untouched the eastern bank of the Sirbits river line here west of Kremenna, Chernopivka, Ploshenka. But with this, the Russians have developed enough to gain control over the town, and we could see this similar development going down south or flanking through the western positions to gain a foothold across the Sirbits river line and expanding it beyond that of the current one from Serhivka to Novodiane. Talking about river lines, we see here in the direction of Pishane, the Russians have made a large advance here northwest of the town, following the capture of the fortified positions and the heights west of Tabeivka north of Pishane. The Russians are now moving towards the next line of Ukrainian defenses to the northwest, as well as in a western direction towards Kulisynikivka, where their objective would be to gain control over the eastern bank of the Utsk river line, as well as to develop offensive operations in the direction of Kupiansk by isolating it from other crossings across the river and develop the offensive operations from that position. So we see that the Russian positions here is to create a artificial pocket by flanking and attacking the Ukrainian Kupiansk positions from three separate directions, from the north, east, and south. In the Kursk section of the front line, there are several developments here as well. The Ukrainians are looking to gain control over Snagost and Apanasovka, which they have captured here by the river line. At the same time, they're pushing further towards Koronevo, where they've so far been unable to gain control over the town, despite 2 weeks of fighting in that direction. Here, the positions in the west, the objective is to gain control over the Russian positions here south of the same river. If we take a look, the river line spans here from the west of Koronevo all the way to the northern parts of it. This means that this southern area is generally isolated except for one part, which is this eastern part where it is connected by land towards Koronevo with no river line cutting it off. Therefore, the Ukrainian objective right now is, with the blowing of bridges here along the same river line, they've managed to limit the supplies to the Russians. The Russians then set up some pontoon bridges, but again, it is limited compared to actual bridges, and they are constantly under fire from the Ukrainian side. With that, the Ukrainian objective is to push here from the eastern parts, from the land bridge, to create a buffer zone where the Ukrainians are able to prevent the Russians from making use of any land bridge to cross over, forcing them up against the river line and flanking the Russian fortified positions from the north. Following that, the Ukrainians will likely also push here from Tetkino in the south and potentially open further from the south to pressure the Russian side on a wide front. So we see here that the Ukrainian objective is to expand their foothold in the Kursk region. And for the first time, Zelensky actually talked about the objective of the Ukrainians with this offensive. He claims that the objective is to create a buffer zone. Such a buffer zone, if this is the objective, we need to define what it looks like. If we think about it, we have to take a look at the Russian sanitary zone. There are multiple stages. The first stage is simply artillery that would be about 15 to 30 kilometers deep. Then there is a second stage, which would be MLR strikes and similar. This about 100 kilometers. And then there's the third stage, which is pretty much most types of firing positions do not generally pass 250, 300 kilometers. So that would be about that much deep. Based on the Ukrainian force and the capabilities, they would not be looking to go to 300 kilometers deep, but instead their limit would be at most 30 kilometers. And it could simply be 30 kilometers from the city of Sumy itself. Between the positions in Sumy to the border, it is less than 30 kilometers, pretty much nowhere. This means that it is not a buffer zone against artillery. The next one would likely be FAB bombs, the glide bombs. They typically fly in from about 50 kilometers from the front line, or in this case, the Sumy city itself would need to fly close to the border to drop the bomb. Therefore, the Ukrainians would be looking to place a lot of air defense within the city of Sumy to defend the city, or to simply shoot down the Russian jets trying to drop the FAB bombs. So if the Russians want to continue bomb Sumy, they would have to fly in over Ukrainian territory and they would be under direct fire from Ukrainian air defense, which would mean that the Ukrainians would either save their city from FAB bombs or that the Russians instead will be losing some jets in the Ukrainian air defense. Now, the issue with this explanation is that the Russians weren't really that heavily bombing Sumy prior to the Kursk offensive. There was a significant increase in the bombing ahead of the Kursk offensive because the Russians were planning on launching their own offensive, but they were limiting the Ukrainian capabilities in the area. So we can see that in the end, it turns out this is indeed just a preemptive strike on the Russian offensive, and the objective simply is to prevent the Russians from launching an offensive into the Sumy region by having the fighting inside the Kursk region, which, yes, it does make sense in terms of fighting outside your country so your country doesn't get destroyed. But in this case, it actually does not make any sense because, well, Sumy is getting destroyed or hammered much stronger now prior to the Kursk offensive than it was now. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are with worse supply lines, worse communication, and a lot more issues that stems from them being in the Kursk region. For example, the Starlink system does not work in Russia. Therefore, the Ukrainians do not have Starlink in the Kursk region, and their communications are much more prone to being interfered or stopped completely or even listened in. Generally, the communications is less safe and less effective compared to the Starlink system, and this means that the Ukrainians are struggling with communication inside the Kursk region. That's not to mention that the Russians are now closer to their own home. They have shorter and faster supply routes, which means that they are able to send troops faster and resupply them faster. At the same time, they have more air force, they have more air defense. Everything is more effective for the Russians in their own home than it is in Ukraine. That means that the Ukrainians are putting themselves in a difficult situation to prevent a Russian attack, but instead it'll likely just be a position where they are at a disadvantage compared to being in their own home field. But what it really shows is that it shows that the Ukrainians can still conduct offensive operations, but according to the reports from the area and recent articles released, the Ukrainians are simply taking too many casualties for this to be worth it. They were already low on manpower, artillery, equipment, especially armored vehicles, and they're losing so many of them driving around in open fields, both in their DRGs, where they get ambushed with multiple vehicles in a single column, or when they just simply drive around in the open field, because all of these are simply open fields, and the Russian Air Force is working, the Russian artillery is working, and just looking at the current results of the offensive operations of the Ukrainians, it has already gone way beyond the Russian losses in the Battle of Avdiivka, much less what we've seen since, with the Russians now advancing in the Avdiivka section of the front line over the past 6 months, covering more territory than the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region in this past 2 weeks. I know 6 months, 2 weeks. Well, the difference is that in the Avdiivka section of the front line, you cannot go more than 5 kilometers without meeting a new defensive line. There's height elevation differences. Generally, it is much more difficult to advance in this area than it is for the Ukrainians to advance in the Kursk region, especially since the Ukrainians also had the initiative, they had the element of surprise, which allowed for a lot of initial advances, which led to a couple hundred square kilometers being captured in the first days. And since then, the Russians have been trying to establish a front line where the Ukrainians are taking advantage of any of the gaps, and they're sending DRGs, which end up having extremely high casualty rates with little to no results directly, but indirectly it spreads the Russian forces thin, which leads to the capture of several villages. But again, this is simply not sustainable for the Ukrainians. They cannot continue this for a long time. And Zelensky has already gone to say, we need more stuff. This is simply unsustainable, which anyone could have said a mile away, because looking at it logistically, the Ukrainians are already struggling in the east and in the south with the lack of manpower, ammunition, and equipment. Yet they start a new offensive operation inside the Kursk region, expecting that all of these issues simply disappear, or what is the idea? Because right now we're seeing that the Russians captured over 50 square kilometers in the Donetsk region, which is, as I said, much more difficult to advance in than in the Kursk region, because the Russians have limited fortified positions compared to the Donetsk region. They were taken with the element of surprise. The situation in Avdiivka is simply not in Russia's favor, and neither was the situation in Kursk. But now it is slowly turning into their favor, and that is generally how you can explain anything in the war in Ukraine. The stuff is typically in Ukraine's favor because Russia pulls some stupid shit that is simply a mistake, and then the Ukrainians take advantage of that. Then the Russians slowly improve over time, and this leads to this slow and steady advance, which just ends up in the long run being much more effective than the fast but large advances that the Ukrainians do, because in the long run, the Russians now have 700,000 soldiers involved in this conflict, and the Ukrainians have about the same amount. Yet the Ukrainians are the ones struggling with manpower issues, and the Russians aren't really complaining about that anymore. This clearly shows that the Russians are using their manpower more effectively and have them better equipped than the Ukrainians, with both lacks equipment and manpower. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.